So there's loads of stuff to talk about, and there'll be bits that I miss out or that we don't cover, but this is going to give you a very general overview of the developments between these two centuries. Now, obviously, patchwork and quilting were around before this and after this, so we're just taking these two centuries as a particular showcase. It's interesting also to say that we're just looking at mainly the patchwork. Patchwork and quilting are two terms which are obviously quite often mixed together. So when we talk about things, we often say a patchwork quilt or a bit of patchwork or some quilting. And they're two actually very distinct crafts. So patchwork is joining pieces of fabric together to create a design, and quilting is a little bit different. It's the stitches that join three layers together. So confusingly enough, these terms are used interchangeably, but actually mean very separate things. And yeah, it can get a little bit confusing between the terminology, but you can have a patchwork coverlet, you can have a patchwork quilt, you can have a patchwork top. They're all various different layers. So what we're kind of concentrating on today is the patchworky element, but that's not to say there wasn't quilting going on as well. So I might occasionally refer to different bits of quilting or that kind of thing, but we're mainly talking about patchwork developments. And in the 18th century, which is where we start our journey, patchwork is very much a fashionable pursuit for ladies of a gentry or middle class. So we're starting kind of at the start of the 18th century. And what we're going to see as we go through the 18th century mainly is we've got two distinct differences between the start of the 18th century and the end of the 18th century. So we've got a difference between the types of materials being used. So you'll see the ones at the start of the century are mainly made of silk. As we go through to the end of the 18th century and into the early 19th century, there's a shift towards very fashionable printed cottons, which become the thing to have. So you'll see a shift in the type of fabrics that are used, but you'll also see a shift in the type of design. So everything that starts at the beginning of the 18th century is very much based around a square block. Squares are much easier to draft. To draft a right angle is much easier to do without any kind of geometric or technical skill. And it can be folded in lots of various ways to create smaller shapes within the square block. So we see very square things at the beginning of the 18th century, but as we move through to the end of the century and into the early 19th century, we see a lot more complicated, tessellating, geometric shapes coming in. And that's all to do with education and being able to draft more complicated shapes with different angles. So you see something like the hexagon appear, and then that becomes incredibly popular, but you don't really see it before the end of the 18th century. So it's a very interesting type of development. So, whoops, there we go. So we're going to start looking at our iconic piece in the Quilter Quilt collection, and this very conveniently is dated to 1718, so it's very much so at the start of the 18th century. And you can see already it's very much so based around a square block. So even though the square blocks are bigger and smaller in various different areas, they're still square. And then within those square blocks, you've got different designs. So I mentioned earlier, it's very easy to fold a square block. So you can fold it diagonally to create some triangles. You can fold it in half and half again to create some smaller squares, but they're still based around the square. This particular piece is an iconic piece for us because it's of international significance. So very little survives from the early 18th century, especially because it's so long ago. It's over 300 years ago that this piece was made. So we're very fortunate to still have this with us, and there's not much surviving, so it really sets a benchmark ideal of what was being made in that particular time. It's one of the most complex pieces also that survives. So you'll be able to see that there's a whole range of figurative motifs as well as the geometric designs. We've got the most fantastic lady and man. We've got a heart shape. We've got some beautiful tulips, which are very complicated flower shapes. And we've got lots of other rural animals as well. So at the bottom, you'll be able to see some swans, some geese, some other kind of farmyard animals. There's a cat with a fish in its mouth. We've got lots of different designs there. And if we were doing this type of design today, we'd probably choose to do it by plique, which is where you cut the shape out and you stick it on a background foundation fabric. That's the easiest way to do it. But in that particular time, plique wasn't really a thing, but mosaic patchwork was. Mosaic patchwork, for those that don't know, is going over a paper template. So you would design the piece on paper, you would cut it up, you would then get a piece of fabric and wrap it around and tack it in place, and then you would sew it all back together again, a bit like a jigsaw. So mosaic patchwork is very accurate. It allows you to join all the shapes up perfectly again, a bit like a jigsaw. But that's a lot harder when you come to curved shapes. So that's great when you've got triangles, you've got angles, you've got straight lines. But when you have circles or complicated shapes like flowers, it becomes a lot more complex. So the person who did this was clearly very, very skilled. They were able to join very difficult curved shapes back together again. So it's an incredibly complex way to do it, but it was an incredibly skilled maker that made this piece. So obviously it has the initials EH, which is just here, and the date 1718. It's quite hard to see because this was in black silk and the black has unfortunately disintegrated, but it's still there enough that we can see. And we always like it when there's a date, a date there, because usually we've got something quite solid to go by, although not always. So we know that it was made in that particular time. The owner of the initials EH is a little bit more of a mystery. So this particular piece was purchased at an auction in 2000. We paid about £3,000 for this piece, I think. We were very lucky because it was kind of hidden in the auction room. So it was quite a small auction. It wasn't one of the big giant sales, and it went relatively under the radar. If this was kind of just pre-internet, so internet was around, but there weren't a lot of online auctions and that kind of thing. So not a lot of people necessarily knew about this piece. If they did, and if it was an online auction today, we would have absolutely no chance of getting this, because obviously a lot more people know about stuff that's being sold at auctions online now, because a bit like with our meeting now, you can be absolutely anywhere in the country. You don't have to send away for the catalogue and sift through it like we used to do in the olden days. So we managed to get this piece at a relatively good price. But as you can see, there's still quite a bit of damage to it. So you can see on the block on the right, you can see some of the paper coming through. All of the papers in this are still intact. So you can see the bits where the fabric has disintegrated away, and you can see the template underneath. So it did require quite a bit of conservation, which we managed to get various different grants to be able to do that. It cost about £12,000 to conserve. But it is the most phenomenal and remarkable piece. In terms of size, it's not huge. It's about 169 centimeters by 182 centimeters. So it's not a massive piece, but it probably had a border on it at some point, which has been since removed, looking at the evidence of the stitching. So it would have been a little bit bigger. In comparison terms, there's another piece in the Montreal Museum, McCord Museum in Canada, which dates from 1726, which features a very similar star in the center, but it doesn't have the complex level of figurative motifs that we have in this piece. So this is absolutely top-notch type of patchwork from the early 18th century, absolutely phenomenal. We know that it was probably made by farming gentry. So we're talking relatively well off. They have to have access to silks, and they have to have access to paper. So paper in the 18th century is made from linen rags, and it's a very expensive commodity. And of course, not everybody is literate in that particular time. So you have to have access to paper that you don't need anymore, spare paper that you are recycling from previous use. As well as access to silks and access to time. So something like this is going to take you an awful long time to design and to sew. There's about 15 to 20 stitches per inch. So it's very, very detailed, very well sewn. Some of the fabrics in here date to about 80 years before 1718. So there's one particular green silk which has evidence of punch marks, which is very popular in fashionable dress in the 1620s and 1630s. So some of the fabrics in here are so much older even than this piece. So it's always fascinating looking at patchwork and what goes into the various bits, various fabrics that make it. So absolutely amazing piece. This is just a bit of a close-up of the letters EH in 1718 and the man and woman block, which stand either side, and the heart, which is fantastic. On the back is linen. So the linen has all been pieced together from various different bits of household linen that weren't needed anymore. The lines that you can see in like a grid shape are cut pieces of flossing. So at some point, there's been an extra backing on this piece, which has since been removed. It could have been because it was then recycled for something else. So all of these little bits of grid line that you see are bits of thread that have been cut, and the tufts are still there, and they're basically sewn what we would call quilted in the ditch, if you like. So they've sewn between the blocks on the front to join it onto the piece at the back. So they've removed some sort of backing, but you can see that actually there's a linen backing underneath that foundation piece. And there are two instances where there are some embroidered letters, EH there, which fits very well, obviously, with the initials on the front, which is great. And that occurs in two places. So those particular initials must have been embroidered on whatever linen somebody had, which is another interesting kind of aspect to it. So this gives you another close-up of one of the particular blocks, which is, I think, one of the most complex ones to make. So it's the lady block. On the left, if you look very closely, you'll be able to see the whole piece, when it was conserved, has been covered with a very fine piece of monofilament netting, silk monofilament netting. So there's a kind of honeycomb structure over the front, which you can see. So that gives you just a real close-up view. You can't tell when you just see the coverlet out, because it's particularly designed so that it's quite invisible to when you look at the whole piece. But it just provides a little bit of stability to the cover and helps prevent any of the decaying silk from kind of falling away. So that's what the conservation, or part of the conservation, was. And as part of the research, when we got the coverlet, we knew the papers were still intact, and we thought it'd be amazing if we'd be able to see if there was any writing on the papers underneath. So papers are usually recycled from things that you don't need anymore. So letters, household accounts. The main story that often goes with patchwork is that it's filled with love letters, which I think is really lovely, but very, very rarely true. Generally, people don't cut up those letters, but it's such a lovely romantic tale. Usually, unfortunately, the letters and the stuff that goes into the papers that go into patchwork are rather more boring. So they're household accounts, they're bits of newspapers, or they're bits of much more mundane letters. So things like schoolwork that you don't need anymore, repetition of lines and letters and handwriting practice. But it will be great to see what kind of letters this person was using in the very early 18th century. So we employed two techniques, or the conservators and the conservation researchers employed two techniques. One of them was using X-rays. So the idea behind X-raying it, if the ink had any kind of metal gall in it, then they would be able to pick up that on an X-ray. So the whole piece was X-rayed, and unfortunately, they must have used a carbon-based ink, a different type of ink, because it didn't show up on any of the X-rays, which was disappointing. But what the X-rays did show was the construction technique and the stitching and bits where the fabric and even the paper had been stitched together to form the papers underneath. So it actually revealed an awful lot about the construction of the piece, which was absolutely fascinating, and something that you would never be able to get from looking at the surface. The second technique that they used was called light transmitted photography. And light transmitted photography is slightly different, but it yielded much, much better results. And some really, really interesting things came out of that. So you can see the block on the right-hand side, you can see the patchwork, but you can also see the lines of the drawing on the paper underneath. So when she originally drafted this lady block, she made the head a lot smaller. So you can see at the top, there's a little circle, and then a very narrow neck that comes out into the body, which is a lot higher. And then the skirt was also going to be a lot thinner. So what she'd done is she'd drawn this block, she drafted it, and then realized there was absolutely no way that that was going to work in such a small scale in patchwork. So instead of discarding that piece of paper, she redrew it on the same template block. And then that was cut up and then reconstructed back together. So the paper reveals the shape that the lady was going to be, which I think is absolutely fascinating. So it shows you part of the design process. And it also did show some text underneath as well. So the swan block that you can see at the bottom there, you can see that the swan originally was going to go in the other direction. So if you look down to the left-hand side, you've got the little tail going that way, and it was actually going to go in the other, facing the other way. And she decided to change the shape of the swan, which is fascinating. The other two blocks, you can see we've got some elements of printed text. So on the left-hand side, we've got some very old-fashioned kind of Gothic copperplate looking text, which has been cut up, which apparently, according to one of our researchers, would be quite old-fashioned by then. But it looks to be some sort of excerpt from a Bible, kind of Bible passage, because you can see on the left-hand side, in the margin, they've got where they write the passage that it comes from. On the right-hand side, we've got something which is a parliamentary speech. So if you flipped around the speech and you put it that way, you'd be able to see it's exactly the same document, which is the parliamentary speech there. Oops, sorry, I went on a bit too fast. But so it yielded amazing results, the light transmitted photography. So that's very early in the 18th century. So as we move through, we're still seeing very much so square things. So this particular piece is quite a recent acquisition for us. We bought this one at auction, and we got this one for a pretty good price as well. We call this one our King George patchwork. So it's squares, and then it's squares on point within squares. So it's still very much following this very square structured theme. And it's all made out of silks. We think it probably dates from about 1720 to 1750. So at some point within there. Something to note with patchwork is quite often the fabrics can be a bit misleading, because quite often we keep fabrics for quite a long time. So I know myself, my own fabric stash, I've got bits in there from 20 years ago. I've got bits of my mum's patchwork and fabric stash. There may even be something that my grandma had in there. So if you think fabrics are quite an expensive commodity, especially silks, they're saved over a very long period of time. So we then put them into our patchwork. It means that it can't be it can't be before that date, but it's quite often after that date. So like the 1718, there was a fabric in there which was 80 years older than the finishing date of the fabric. So we always have to look for the newest fabric in there and allow for a little bit of time of, sitting in the stash and being made up as well. But there are some particularly amazing yellow silks in this piece. Two of them I put there. You can see one says King and one says Save. There are some other pieces throughout. There's God, and there's also GR, which is for King George, with a picture of the crown underneath it as well. So at some point, this was a gold printed on yellow silk. It was a commemorative silk for King George. And because there's no Roman numerals underneath it, it was most likely King George I. And he ruled from 1714 to 1727. So that's going to be produced from that particular period. So we know that the coverlet has to be made after that time. But it still very much firmly places it in the mid-18th century, which you can see from the general style. It has very much so a feel of the same 1718 kind of look, and is also made from these silks as well, which is very much the fashionable fabric of choice this particular time. So these are two chair seat covers. They're also from the mid-18th century. You can see again, we've got that square block, which has been quartered into triangles. And we've got a lovely star shape, which tends to feature in quite a lot of these in the center of these patchworks. These particular ones have been recycled from fashionable dress. So we've got some embroidered items. So if you imagine the beautiful embroidered waistcoats that gentlemen used to wear, the wonderful woven silks that the ladies used to wear as part of their huge gowns. These have been recycled. Some of them may also be furnishing silks as well. And because they are chair seat covers, and they needed a bit more stability, the papers again are still intact in the back. So this is the reverse of the chair seat cover, which it's been put on the chair and then it's been unpicked and removed. So they've all been saved. There are 6 of these in our collection altogether. You can see the wonderful papers in the back as well. So we've got some here, which is just numbers, which is probably handwriting practice and schoolwork. But we also have printed text as well. So we've got some great various array of different things. This particular chair seat cover has a really important ribbon in it, which you can see at the bottom here. So it's in this triangle here and this triangle here, and it's been joined together. And the ribbon says no popery, no slavery. So it's a woven ribbon that has a very political stance left over from the Glorious Revolution of 1688. So that ribbon is produced in the 1680s. The whole patchwork itself is probably from the mid 18th century. So again, you've got that saving of fabrics, which has then been put into something of a later date. And interestingly enough, I mean, a lot of domestic pieces from, the 18th and 19th century don't necessarily have political stances or don't tell you an awful lot about the maker. But obviously the family that it came from must have had a certain political leaning to have had this ribbon in their family in the first place, in the same way that the speech, the parliamentary speech, tells you something about the papers that were in the house of the person who made the 1718. So they're all very tiny snippets of evidence that you can only get from looking very, very closely at some of these pieces of patchwork. So at the same time as we got the chair seat covers, we also acquired this fragment of patchwork, which is about 1 metre square. This has actually just been conserved very generously with a grant from the Leech Trust, because unfortunately it was in quite poor condition. But it's again another example of that mid 18th century silk patchwork. So we have these lovely kind of starburst stars, one in the centre, and then these other smaller ones. And then we've got the squares again, which have been quartered into triangles. So none of them are on the complexity level of the 1718, but they are showing the same kind of silks, the same kind of designs again, and also the wonderful papers in the back, which you can see here as well. You can see some of the corners are a little bit dog-eared. It hasn't survived in particularly great condition, but it has now been conserved, which has got rid of a lot of the staining, and made these papers a lot more stable as well. So pieces are not likely to fall out anymore, which is great. Interestingly enough, the person who made this didn't have the same level of technical skill as some of the other pieces that we've got in the collection. These particular medallions here have not been incorporated into the patchwork. They've sort of just been plonked on top and then stitched down. So somebody had a vision of what they wanted to do, but didn't quite necessarily have the patchwork know-how of how to get there. So it's quite interesting that the stitches are quite a lot bigger and a lot coarser than they are in something like the 1718, which is very, very finely done. But it shows you that lots of different people are having a go at patchwork. And again, it was the ladies of the kind of gentry or the upper middle class who were making pieces of patchwork at home. So we know in the 18th century that it was very much, patchwork is very much a term that everybody knew. And we know that because it features in things like popular literature. So there was a play called Hampstead Heath by Thomas Baker in 1706, and he makes reference to the fact that patchwork is the fashion of the age. So it's obviously something everybody's doing. And if you've ever read Gulliver's Travels by Jonathan Swift, the Lilliputian tailors make Gulliver an outfit, which is all patchwork together because he's so huge. So they have to get all their tiny pieces of fabric together. And his trousers look like the patchwork made by the ladies of England. So it's obviously something that's very, very, very much in modern parlance for them. They know exactly what patchwork is for it to be referred to in some kind of popular literature like that. So far, we've seen things which are very silk-based, very block-based, and that's moving up to kind of into the mid-18th century. By the time we get to the end of the 18th century, we see a real shift in both the types of things being produced and the fabrics being produced as well. So this particular piece is absolutely huge. It's about 3 meters long, so it's an absolutely giant piece. But you can see there's not a piece of silk in sight for this one, and it's a very, very simple frame piece. So a frame coverlet or a frame quilt is made just by literally frames or borders being added on as you go out. And this is very much a British technique. And the pieces of fabric that you've got here are printed cottons. Sometimes they're called chintzes when they have the full variety of colours, but they are very finely block printed and later roller printed pieces of printed cotton. And these particular fabrics, they date from the end of the 18th century. So it looks very, very different to what we've been seeing so far. You can see a huge contrast. This dark ground was very popular in the 1780s and the 1790s. And there's also this motif here you can see with the bird and the eggs in the nest. Again, was something that was quite popular in that time. And it will be echoed later in some block printed panels, which we're going to have a look at in a minute. So they've chosen to put this particular piece in the center and then surround it with these frames. Now, this one is actually a quilt, which you can't really see very well from the picture. So the person was doing patchwork and quilting together. Something to note from the pieces that you've already seen, the ladies of fashionable England may have done patchwork, but they didn't do quilting. So quilting was very much the domain of a professional. It would quite often be corded, but sometimes flat quilting. But the ladies would not do that. They did patchwork. Patchwork was the genteel thing to do. So this one combines patchwork and quilting together, which is a little bit more unusual. And we start to see that now as we go through into the 19th century. Sometimes you'll find them separate and sometimes you'll find them together with varying degrees of success as to whether you can do both, because obviously they're very different techniques. But this one is a patchwork quilt. Interestingly enough, at some point, this one traveled all the way to Australia. And when we got it in 2009, it was sent back from Australia back to England. But it was sent surface mail, so it took about 8 months to come. So we were a little bit worried as to when it was going to get here. But it's traveled an awful lot of miles to come all the way back again, which is very interesting. But it was made in Britain originally. On the right-hand side there is a very small piece of fragment of a quilt, which dates from the late 18th century and shows you the technique of copper plate printing. So this kind of thing is block printing, where you've got a giant block which is engraved and then it's pressed down and then it's repeated. And there'll be a small indicator mark, a kind of like a small dot, which is where the block printer knows to line up ready for the next block when he prints it. But to be able to get very, very fine printing, they also engraved copper plates and copper rolls as well. And this just is a really enlarged close-up of a copper plate print, which shows you how fine they could get some of the detail on the printing on this cotton. So this is quite blown up to much bigger scale than it actually is on the fabric. So it's just to give you an example of some of the amazing detail on some of the printed cottons which were coming out. So obviously being able to print really beautiful designs on things was the latest thing in the late 18th century. Really beautiful designs. So silks are fantastic, and there are some printed silks and some woven silks, but it was a whole new world to have all these beautiful printed cottons, especially when they became much more available to everybody as well. Throughout the 18th century, you've got a very unusual ban on printed cottons, which is quite an interesting one. I don't think I've got my information here for that, but the ban basically meant that you couldn't have imported cottons because they were worried about the impact on the British trades of wool and silk. So things like very fancy chintzes over from India were banned from import into Britain. But of course, what happens when you ban anything is it just makes it more popular and it makes people more determined to get these things. So what would happen is that they would be imported into Britain for immediate re-export, but would unfortunately go missing. And then they would be sold on the black market. So people did still have access to these things. And you could still wear these things and have them in your house if you had them before the ban came in place. So people would just say that they already had them, or, this old thing, I've had it for ages. So they would still be able to wear and to have these wonderful things. But then they lifted the ban, and British manufacturers managed to get around this by printing on something called fustian, which is a mixture of cotton and linen. So it wasn't quite covered by the cotton ban. And in that particular period of time throughout the 18th century, they really refined all of their printing techniques and their dyeing techniques and their colors so that they could compete with external markets. And so you do, by the end of the 18th century, get some amazingly beautiful colors and prints, some very fine prints, lots of different colors and printing techniques. Which produces these absolutely fantastic printed cottons, which is why you see them in such amazing abundance in all our patchworks, because they're so amazing and so beautiful. So we're going to see some of those examples now. So this is a border of a piece which dates from the very early 1800s. So we're into the 19th century now. And you can see we've got some wonderfully tessellating hexagons there. Hexagons are a fantastic geometric shape because they tessellate with each other. So they've got that 60-degree angle, which is also really easy to piece over as well. So these are all paper pieced. They're using the paper template, getting a really accurate shape, and then piecing them all together. And you can see this wonderful array of printed cottons. So it's amazing when you look at them, some of the detail and some of the designs look incredibly contemporary when we think about them. If you saw them out in isolation, you would think they were from the 1960s or the 1950s. But actually they were produced, 200 years before then. So they're absolutely fantastic. And the vibrancy of the color is absolutely brilliant as well. So you can see these really strong colors coming out. Some of them are very simple repeat blocks, such as this one, but then you've got some very, very complex ones and some very likely to be furnishing pieces, which are these large scale flowers. The smaller repetitive prints are much more likely to be dress prints or blouse prints, but you've got a real mix of things going on there. And of course, the plain ones as well. So where did they get their fabrics from? Well, they would save lots of scraps of fabric. They would swap them with their friends, but we also know that you could buy pieces for patchwork as well. So quite often we think of patchwork as being a very thrifty thing. So you don't have enough of something, therefore you have to piece things together. But actually that's not necessarily the case, because the ladies who are doing this are actually quite wealthy. So the fabrics are still expensive and they're still saving all these little scraps. And quite often we'll see a shape where things have been joined together, so they're still using every tiny scrap, but they're creating it for a very beautiful effect. And quite a lot of these things are decorative covers, so they're not necessarily being made to keep you warm. They're being made to show off your wonderful array of fabrics and your fantastic skill sets of being able to create these wonderful designs. And also you're showing off the amount of time you have to sit and do all of this intricate work. So you're not working, you're not doing anything else. You're creating these beautiful decorative pieces for your house to show off your skills and your wealth. So you have these wonderful shapes. And what's great about this piece is this row here. So we've got the row of diamonds, and this could just been a square. It would be a lot easier just to make it a normal square. But the maker has put a slight curve on all of these. So you can see it's not actually a diamond, it's slightly curved. And to do that, just that extra added bit of finesse shows that someone had a little bit more skill and a bit more time. And also makes it, of course, a lot more complicated because you're not just joining a straight line together, but it makes it, just that little bit extra. This is a very interesting piece because it's actually just one giant frame. So this is what it looks like around, but the actual center piece is missing. So it's obviously been damaged or removed, but this particular bit of patchwork was highly prized and was kept for some particular reason. So it's quite an odd shaped fragment, but it does have a really good array of different printed cottons in there. This is another fantastic example of such an amazing array of printed cottons that they had available to them, and also somebody's fantastic technical skill as well. So this is a piece which is a pelmet for a tester bed. So tester beds had like a canopy at the top. So we don't have the post joining it like you would on a four-poster, but you do have a rectangular canopy which comes over the top of the bed. And so this is going along the three sides of that particular canopy. And so it's actually just over 5 meters long in a strip, this piece. So we keep it rolled up in the store. But each particular section of this is slightly different. So some of the sections are just hexagons, which you can see here. And some of them are much more complicated shapes, such as these two flower designs. So again, you've got these wonderful curves, which are very, very difficult to do. You've got these very small triangular shapes, which end on a curve, and you can see the stitching is really, really fine. So the person who's done this is very, very skilled. And they've also been very particular in the pieces of fabric that they've chosen. Very particular fussy cutting is what we call it. So they've placed the design, the printed design, in the center of their shape. So these triangles, for example, the little blue flower has been perfectly placed in the center and faces in the correct direction to go around. We've got various other examples of really good fussy cutting as well. So the lines on this square, for example, all join up. So they've made it, they've really thought about each piece and which piece of fabric they're cutting from, which suggests they've got maybe a little bit more fabric to hand. So when you're fussy cutting, you're not using every single scrap because you're very selectively picking which motif you want to cut out and then incorporate into your patchwork, and then quite often forms a secondary design. But again, you can see the amazing array of different fabric prints, the different colors, how well they're printed, that kind of thing. So very highly prized cotton fabrics in the early 19th century. This is another piece. This is quite a large piece. It's called our Mary Prince patchwork coverlet because there's a tape on the outside that has her name on, Mary Prince 1803. So we have a date for this piece, which we always like, which is great. This is a type of elongated hexagon, which has just been repeated, but they've organized the colors into frames. So from a distance, it has its own kind of secondary pattern rather than just being hexagons around the whole lot. This is a particularly interesting piece because, again, it shows all of the amazing printed cottons, but it also shows that sometimes dates are not quite what we think. And as museum professionals or curators or volunteers in museums, we have testimony and we have bits of family provenance that comes with pieces. And sometimes that's true, and sometimes that's not true, which we'll explore later. But usually when we have a date with something, we kind of think, well, that's great because nobody signs a date that's different. And because the date for this piece is on the outside, usually that's kind of how you finish something off. You finish something, you put your name and the date on it that you finished. So 1803 is the date of this piece. But in the center of this piece here is a collection of fabrics, that's the fabrics on the outside. They're the fabrics in the middle, which you can see there. We've got this lovely bright orange, and we've also got some of these other fabrics. The fabric dyeing technique, which was used to produce some of these fabrics, which we find in the center of this piece, is called the lapis dyeing technique. So it allowed blue and red to be printed right next to each other without there having to be two separate processes. So whenever you have a printed cotton of lots of different colors, each one is a separate process. And the more colors you have and the more processes you have, the more expensive it makes it because it creates more time to create the piece. So when you can kind of cut down on the number of processes, it speeds up manufacture, which is always good. So being able to print blue and red next to each other without having a gap and printing those separately was called the lapis dyeing technique, but that wasn't invented until 1811. So there's no way that this quilt could have been finished in 1803 when the fabric in there had to have been created after 1811. So that poses a little bit of a quandary. So why is that fabric there when the quilt is dated earlier? So that doesn't quite make sense. So one of the theories that they put forward is that the center part at some point might have been damaged. If you think about where quilts lay on a bed and where the center is, I guess you could have had candle damage, it could have been a stain, it could have been something else that's happened. And so the whole center part, the central hexagon, we think has been removed and replaced with something that's more up-to-date fabrics created at a slightly later time. Or she made the tape when she started and actually it took her an awful long time to make. So we never quite know what the stories of these things are, but sometimes the fabrics tell us a different story to what we think is going on in these kind of pieces, which happens more than we think. So this is another piece. We date this from about the 1810s. And this is probably one of our most complex frame pieces that we have in the collection. So this is called our Billings coverlet. I think it's about 16 or 17 individual frames for this piece. And it's incredibly small scale pieces of patchwork. Again, it shows the amazing printed cottons, but it shows the geometric skill of being able to draft and design something like this because all of the frames line up perfectly. So when you see some of our other patchwork pieces and our quilts, they're very beautiful, but sometimes they haven't quite been measured correctly or they haven't allowed for a bit of seam allowance. So the triangles might end halfway rather than being a full triangle, or a square might be lopped off into a rectangle. This one has immense precision. So usually turning corners is quite hard with things like patchwork, especially if you want to do a mitered corner. So you can just end it and then start another row, but this one is all mitered and it all turns the corners perfectly. So you'll be able to see here, they've been able to think of a way to infill the corner, which is particularly true for these shapes in the corners here and also around here. So whenever you look at a corner, you'll be able to see how expertly they've managed to turn it, which requires an awful lot of geometric skill. Again, this is all paper pieced, so it would have taken an incredibly long time. It's all hand sewn, all paper pieced. So it indicates a certain level of society again, along with the printed cottons that also indicates the same thing. So it's one of our most complex geometric pieces that we've got. This is just a sample of the small center that you can see. Within even this small amount, we've already got so many frames going on, which is pretty amazing. So this is a contrast. So this dates from 1811. So these two pieces side by side, we can see they're pretty much of the same period, but they're being made by two very different classes of women. So the Billings coverlet that we've just seen is obviously very much so a lady of leisure from a large household or large kind of estate. She has an awful lot of time in her hands and access to paper and to fabrics. The one on the right hand side, it's very beautiful. It's very striking actually in exhibition. But the fabrics in here are much cheaper and they're much more mass produced and a lower quality. So you'll be able to see the color palettes quite limited. And the pieces themselves, the shapes are quite irregular. So it's definitely not been done by paper piecing, which would give you a very regular shape. So what's happened on this one is they've just actually applied it. They've appliqued things to a backing fabric. So it's a bit like a collage. They've got a shape and they've put it on and then they've sewn around it. But it's a little bit more haphazard. So none of the shapes are very regular. None of the triangles particularly join up or they're overlapping. And the shape in the center has been done a bit like when you cut out like a paper snowflake, something like that. So they've cut things out and then they've got the shapes left over and they've used those shapes to create the holes as well. So it's a really beautiful piece. And actually in its simplicity is really, really striking and really good. But it just shows you that actually there is a whole spectrum of things being made. So whilst I've shown you an awful lot of things from very high class families in the early 19th century, people are still doing patchwork and making patchwork at much lower down the social scale. They're just maybe creating things that are looking a bit different. And it certainly would have been a lot less time to create this piece than it would a paper pieced one. So her level of skill is perhaps not quite the same level as the one we're seeing in the Billings. And the stitching as well is a little bit more rough and ready. So where the fabric is disintegrated away, you can see some of the very large stitches which have been left behind, which is perhaps a little bit more attainable than the standards that have been set with some of the other pieces. But the fabrics are also much lower quality as well. So you can see they're just mainly blue and brown prints. There's a couple of much nicer prints there, which are probably a little bit older and have been recycled from something else, but they're quite plain. This particular indigo print, which you see in the center, which is also repeated in the frames, was quite low class by this particular time, and the haberdashers would store it under the counter because it was a little bit embarrassing. So you would have to ask for it, and they wouldn't display it out in their shop because the fashionable ladies would be like, no, that's very low class fabric. So this is a type of fabric that's you can ask for, but is not very fashionable at this particular point. So it's somebody making this piece and having a beautiful vision, and she does embroider it. It's got a name on this one. It says S. Challens 1811. So we don't unfortunately know anything more about the maker apart from this, but we do have a date, and it places it very firmly in that early 19th century, and it just gives you a bit of a contrast of the types of things that are being made. So this piece here is from between the 1820s and 1840s, and it's actually a quilt, so it's very densely quilted. It's very beautiful. It's from the Sidmouth area, and we call it our Sidmouth quilt. And you'll see that the frames thing is continuing. So frames we find a lot in our British patchwork. And in the center here is this beautiful block printed panel, which has a bird feeding its young in a nest. So this is a close-up of the panel here. And this is all block printed. The one on the left is an individual panel we have in our fabric collection, and it was a very popular panel. A lot of those were produced. There's a quilt in the Bowes Museum, which I think uses about 8 or 12 of these all in the same quilt. So these are block printed panels, which are produced specifically for use in domestic patchwork. You could put them in the center of your quilt or dotted around in the quilt. You could use them as chair covers or cushions. So they were produced a bit like panels are today. So when you go to the fabric shop and you get a Christmas panel or another type of panel, and they're repeated, and you could ask for however many you wanted. So I'll have 4, or I'll have 6, or I'll just have 1, and they would chop one off for you, and then you could incorporate into your patchwork. So this was a very, very popular design. I've seen that in quite a lot of different quilts, but they were produced for all sorts of commemorative things as well. And they were very popular in the first kind of 2 to 3 decades of the 19th century. So 1800, 1825-ish. And quite often they'll feature things like birds, they'll feature flowers in bouquets or cornucopia, or they'll commemorate battles or particular things. So there was a commemorative one for the Golden Jubilee of King George III. There was the marriage of Prince Charlotte to Prince Leopold of Saxe-Coburg in 1816. There was a particular panel done for that. Wellington's victories at the Battle of Victoria in 1813 and Waterloo in 1815. These were all panels that were produced, and then people would quite patriotically put them into their domestic patchworks. So here's another fragment that we've got. You can see this one features a vase of flowers, and I think there's a bird on there as well. So that was quite a popular one. That was an octagonal one. The one in the center of this panel, also octagonal, and is floral based. And then this one here is our Wellington patchwork, which dates from 1834. It's got a date in the quilting in this particular one from 1834. So all the fabrics are from the 1820s and 1830s. And we have this fantastic printed panel in the center here, which it says Wellington Waterloo. So the panel would have been printed after 1815. So that kind of gives you the general dates for these types of panels being produced. I realized I'm talking a lot, and I'm running a little bit late time. Are we okay for time? If I just carry on talking, yeah. Okay, so this is another panel. You'll see a fantastic red panel in the center there, which is, again, octagonal, wonderful cornucopia. This is a quilt that we've got from the Cornwall area, which has got also some fantastic prints in there as well. So one thing I would say is just take a mental note of this panel, because we might be revisiting it later. And then we get later into the middle of the 19th century. We've got the wonderful hexagon again, tessellating beautifully there. These fabrics are all from the 1840s and 50s. So we're still very much in a very printed cotton kind of vibe going on here in the mid-19th century. It's got a bit of a plique around the corner on the left-hand side. The other one is just lots of different variations of using hexagon rosettes or making it into swags or different shapes. So it's still very printed cotton based by the mid-19th century. But as we move through into the later parts, we start to see printed cottons really declining in terms of fashionability. So these two quilts here date from the 1860s to 1870s. You can see the fabric colors are starting to change a little bit. Fabric manufacture, printed cotton manufacture has changed slightly. There's a lot more roller printing. There's a lot more reducing the number of colors and things to reduce the number of processes, and therefore making cotton more mass produced and much cheaper. And of course, when things are cheaper, it means they're available to the lower classes, and therefore you want to distinguish yourself from the lower classes by picking something different. So we then get a whole swathe of late Victorian pieces where the middle to upper classes are really wanting to distinguish themselves and use different fabrics. So by the 1860s, cotton patchwork is becoming very unfashionable. And there's a quote from the Ladies' Manual of Fancy Work, and there's a lady called Mrs. Pullen who wrote that. And she is very scathing now of people who are using cotton for patchwork, because things are all moving towards silk and velvet again. So they are becoming the fashionable fabrics. So she says in her Manual of Fancy Work in 1859, "Of patchwork with calico I have nothing to say. Valueless indeed must be the time that a person can find no better use for it than to make ugly counterpanes or quilts from pieces of cotton. Emphatically, the proverb is true of cotton patchwork. It is not worth either gas or candlelight. So she thinks that they're horrible now and everybody should move away from using cotton patchwork. And instead, you should move into using silks and velvets. So we get this very different look for the later half of the 19th century, which is quite often what we associate with Victorian living rooms. When we go to Victorian museums and we see that late Victorian over-furnished look, the china dogs on the mantelpiece and the big aspidistra plants and the very over-furnished parlours of the late Victorian period are very much filled with a lot of this type of silk and velvet patchwork. Becomes very popular. So crazy patchwork was very popular, which you can see on the left-hand side here. They still have an awful lot of mosaic patchwork going on, a lot of paper piecing, but we're using these different fabrics, which are now the fashionable fabrics. And that's in no part also due to the rise of the aniline dye, the artificial dyes, which are very vibrantly coloured and work very well on silk and wool. So you get these almost neon coloured pieces of silk coming in the later 19th century, which are incredibly bright and incredibly vibrant. The fashionable dress also is wearing an awful lot of these pieces. So you have an awful lot of that left over and you can work these small pieces into your patchwork. And we find a lot of not only bed pieces, but also domestic pieces like tea cozies and cushions and table covers and antimacassars and things to cover pretty much every surface in your house, which you can decorate with all of this really over-furnished, over-fancy patchwork. We often call it fancy work because they usually add embroidery and stuff onto there as well. So very time consuming, but showing off what is now the fashionable fabric, which is silk and velvet. So these two pieces here give you a really good idea of that. Again, this is another piece from the late Victorian period. It's different strips of mosaic patchwork, but you can see around every single shape is some gold, a very fine gold silk cord, which has gone around every single shape, which must have taken absolutely ages. This particular piece was made apparently for Colonel Ridalsh and his wife, who were a family who had a large house called Felfoot House on Lake Windermere in the Lake District, and it was made by the servants, the female servants, for the mistress of the house, apparently. So these are lower class people, but using the fabrics of the mistress's dresses or her old dresses and offcuts to make her a really, really stunning piece. We're not sure whether it was, he married twice. We're not sure whether it was made for the first wife or the second wife, because they both fit within that period where it would have been popular. So we say it's somewhere between 1860 and 1890. But again, very typical of that late Victorian look, which you quite often find the silks and velvets. Again, another piece of very fancy work. It uses a log cabin technique and pieces of silk, but it's also very heavily embroidered as well. So around the fans around the outside are some very beautiful figures, which are probably taken from magazine inspiration. And there's a lot of floral designs as well. And then in the corners is Queen Victoria's head. It was a Jubilee piece made for 1887, probably an exhibition piece. So there's a little Queen Victoria head in the corner of each one. And that survived in incredibly good condition as well as those other pieces. So the fashionable is silk and velvet, but that's not to say that cotton isn't still being used, and it was, and it's a little bit more practical. Obviously, the other fabrics can't be washed very well, whereas patchwork in cotton is a little bit more practical, especially for bed coverings. So this is another technique that was very popular in the late Victorian period, which is a log cabin. Log cabin is great because you have half light and half dark, and then you can rotate the blocks to create secondary designs in the patchwork, which is forms lots of different overall looks. So this one obviously has the diamonds, but you can do zigzags, you can do stripes. So it's a very effective technique, and also uses lots of different scraps of different fabric because it works really on tonal value rather than exact color. So cotton is still being used. And where we do get the cottons being used, you'll see it's such a marked difference in the color palette and the type of printing to the start of the 19th century. So these particular pieces are made for the end of the 19th century. They're known as conversation prints because they quite often feature designs which are a little bit more conversational and novelty. So you can see there's some trumpets here, there's some playing cards, there's some dominoes. they quite often featured animals, or they featured sporting motifs, that kind of thing. So, but you also notice that there's not an awful lot going on in terms of complexity of the print. So it's just roller printed flowers, or one or two colors. So very, very cheap and mass produced type of fabric by the end of the 19th century in terms of the printed cottons. That's just a close-up of one of the more unusual ones. So there's a little jockey riding a horseshoe, and then one of them's fallen over. So they're very kind of sweet, different prints from the end of the 19th century. And then the only other main one to mention is the use of turkey red, which was popular throughout the 19th century, but particularly in the later 19th century for things like signature quilts. So this is a signature quilt from Sheriff Hutton, and people would embroider their names on the squares, usually as a fundraising activity. And then this would raise money for the church or raise money for the local community, and is also a great social history document as well. So you can see the people who were in the village, or the people who visited that fair and signed their name, and you can trace their various routes, especially when it's quite a close community made piece. So that gives you a look at the sweep at the 19th century. So of course, Epworth Old Rectory has an amazing coverlet in their collection, which they believe date from the 18th century. You may recognize the panel in the center. We've already seen that a few slides ago, which is in one of our pieces from Cornwall. So I think the story goes, and you will be able to correct me if I'm wrong. So they believe the coverlet was made by the Bolton sisters, who were friends of John Wesley, and they made the coverlet, and John slept under it when he visited them in Oxfordshire. We know that John Wesley died in 1791, so the coverlet was thought to have been made in the 18th century for him to be able to sleep under it, obviously. So if that was true, then we're probably thinking that it would look maybe slightly different to what it looks like now. So from the pieces that we've seen, looking through the 18th and 19th centuries, the indicators of this particular piece will probably place it more into the 19th century than it would into the 18th century. So the panel in the center there, those block printed panels are not really made in the 18th century. They're made in the first decades of the 19th century and then used in the patchwork. As I said, we have one in our piece which dates from around the 1820s to 1830s. So that would probably place a very similar type of timeline for that center. The other things we can see there is we've got it made from hexagons. So hexagons were around in the 1790s, but kind of only just really. So we don't find them much before that. And that's due to the change of the types of shapes that we get. So that's to show you the two panels side by side, ours and the Epworth Old Rectory one. So the hexagons we have are much more likely to be the early 19th century that they're being made. So I'm hopefully going to go and see this in the flesh. It would be fantastic. I'll be able to have a look at some of the other fabrics. But things that we also need to be wary of, which are a little bit difficult, are that quite often things are repaired, and they're repaired much later than the time that they were made. Because as we'll have seen in some of our pieces, fabrics can disintegrate over time, especially brown fabrics, which have an iron mordant and which rot through the fabric. So we find that in quite a few of our early cotton pieces, and the brown fabrics have gone. So there are quite a few bits on here which very possibly are hexagons that have been placed over the top and have been applied onto the coverlet, and the original fabric underneath is probably disintegrated. So that's probably the case for this one here, which is a 20th century fabric, and also possibly here as well with a navy as a 20th century fabric. This piece here is probably dates from about the 1820s, and this one here as well, we think possibly the 1820s. So we do have quite a few original fabrics in there just from these couple of photographs, which place it within the 1820s mark along with the panel. And then I think we've got one more picture. Yeah, these two here, these are definitely 20th century fabrics here. So they're not original to when the coverlet was made. But we will probably, if we have a close look, we'll probably be able to see that they've been applied on top. And it has the most wonderful border, this really vibrant red. And when Annie came to see us, we had another quilt out which had a really similar fabric in, which again dated from the 1820s to 30s. This fantastic bright red ground, this furnishing fabric. So I think the date is probably looking a little bit more into the 19th century than into the 18th century, which obviously poses the interesting question of where stories come from. So we've got, things in our collection as well, which come with amazing family provenance. But when you actually start to look at the fabrics or the timeline of the family history, sometimes things don't always quite add up. And that's what makes these objects so fascinating, is that you have to kind of work out quite what's happened along its journey. And it adds extra mysteries, but extra interest as to what happened and where stories come from, which is always an interesting one to follow up. So that's the end of the presentation. I'm really sorry I've overrun slightly.